Well, I welcome you back tonight. Thank you for coming out to another edition of Church History. We continue with our examination of the Imperial Church, which you remember goes from roughly the beginning of the 4th century to the beginning of the 5th century. So as we continue our examination of the Imperial Church tonight, we're going to bring this portion of the church age in for a landing. We're going to finish up our view of the Imperial Church tonight, and to do that I want to do something a little different than what you've experienced in the past, and that is I want to talk about the expansion of Christianity out from the Imperial Church itself, out beyond the borders of the Roman Empire. And then we'll come back and we'll discuss very briefly the end of the imperial age. Because I don't think that it's fair, and I think this would be true of many of the historians that I've read on the subject of church history, it really wouldn't be fair to just consider the church inside the Roman Empire, because there is much going on outside the Roman Empire as well. So we'll start there, specifically where Christianity went. Now, when I say outside, geographically, I'm referring to the area outside of the official boundaries of the Roman Empire, or what we would consider the official boundaries of the Roman Empire. But we're also, in a sense, talking about outside the time frame of the Imperial Church as well. So some of what we're going to talk about tonight occurred even before Constantine was converted, and came to pass outside, quote unquote, the Roman Empire, even in the days prior to Constantine coming to faith. So this isn't just about the Imperial Church age. Much of it occurs in that period of time, but some of it occurs even before. So it would be appropriate for us to do that. To help you then, I have included in my outline a map, and I'd ask if you would to pass those around. It's a little bit blurry, and I apologize for that. This was the best map that I could get. Now, if you're watching by Zoom or by video, you will need to go to the website and pull up my outline for tonight, and you'll find this image at the bottom of the outline to follow along. I'll try to just make reference to where I'm at on this map, so if you're not looking at the map, you at least have some idea of what we're talking about. As you can see, this is a map of the Mediterranean basin, okay? So this encompasses all of the quote-unquote known world at the time, all right? The Roman Empire, of course, it covers much of this area, but not all of it, okay? Not all of it. In the darker yellow or orange color is where Christianity began in each of those particular areas. So the spread of Christianity, or the extent of Christianity, prior to about 300, prior to the beginning of the 4th century. And then the yellow color is where it expanded even up to the 7th century. Okay? And you can see the green line in there is some of the monastic movements that took place and where they went from the 4th to the 6th centuries. That won't be important for our discussion. But nonetheless, you could also notice that there's a number of place names on here which will help you to figure out some of the places we were talking about. For example, last week we talked about Augustine. If you look at the top of Africa, North Africa, you'll see Hippo there. Its name is printed in the Mediterranean, but it's pointing there to the north of Africa. And so that's where Hippo was, that Augustine was. And you can see where Constantinople is, the Black Sea coming together to the Dardanelles. You can see where Palestine and Arabia are, and so forth. All right, so I'll be making some references to some of these locations as we go along. So the church, during the period of time up to 600, end of the 7th century, end of the 6th century, sorry, expanded greatly throughout the world, okay? And so let's talk about it as it goes in every direction. probably the greatest expansion of the church was to the east. Okay, so if you go from Constantinople there at the lower left corner of the Black Sea, east of there is to the east, right? And where it went mostly was in that direction. Now, it certainly did go to Europe, it did go to Spain, but there's a lot more of the world to the east than there is to the west. I mean, you think this map, theoretically goes all the way to China in this direction to the east, and so there's a good deal of space out there. The expansion to the east was primarily through the language known as Syriac. The Syriac language was a language closely akin to Aramaic. You remember Aramaic was sort of the common language of Jews in the first century. Some of the Bible was written in Aramaic. You remember that Mel Gibson decided to have everybody in his movie The Passion of the Christ speak Aramaic, okay, because that was sort of the common language. This Syriac was similar to that, but it was an Eastern language. Now, you have to remember something. We forget this. In the Roman Empire, Latin was the language of politics. Greek was the language of commerce. Because Greek was known worldwide. Latin was a more localized language. Greek was a worldwide language, and so Greek speakers from all over the world could do business with Greek speakers anyplace else in the world. Latin was more the language for politics. But by the first century, most Jews had stopped speaking Hebrew. In fact, most Jews by the first century couldn't even read or understand Hebrew. It was a foreign language to all practical purposes because, again, where are these people situated? In the midst of the Roman Empire. They had been under the control of the Greeks and the Romans now for several hundred years. And so multiple generations of people had grown up as Jews, no longer knowing the language of their forebears. Okay? And that's important. In stopping to speak this, most couldn't understand it. And so you had to have the scriptures translated into other languages in order to understand them. Now, this is true for all of us. None of us in this room, I don't think, can read Koine Greek. So none of us can read the Old Testament in its native language. So we need men, learned men, to translate it into a language we understand. Now, that, by the way, was a very important thing during the days of the Reformation and the Enlightenment period. Getting the Bible into the language of the people was important. But that is not the first time that's done. That's going all the way back to the first century. You remember that prior even to the coming of Christ, the Old Testament had been translated into Greek. That book was known as the Septuagint. The 70 authors who wrote that or translated that developed a Greek version of the Old Testament that the typical Jew of the first century could read because he was familiar with Greek. The New Testament writers, as you know, wrote in Greek, and most of their citations of the Old Testament come from the Septuagint. They quote directly from the Greek version of the Old Testament when they attempt to do so. There was also a translation of the Old Testament into Aramaic, which is called Targums. Targums was used for Jews to be able to read it in the synagogue. Again, they couldn't read Hebrew, so it was translated into Aramaic, the natural language of Jews in the time. So the early Christians then possessed both Aramaic and Greek copies of the Old Testament. They had those in front of them. And in the second century, a Syriac translation of both of the Testaments then appeared. Okay, so the timeline would be, you come into the first century, you've got Greek and Aramaic versions of the Old Testament available. The life of Christ occurs, and then the Gospels are written in Greek, and then you have the epistles written in Greek. Okay, so now you have a Greek Old Testament and a Greek New Testament. And now as you begin to move out from there, you're going to have other people who are going to need to understand what's written in those letters and books, and so it's going to need to be translated. And so a Syriac translation shows up in the second century. Its name was called the Peshitta. The word Peshitta is the same word as the word Vulgate in Latin. It simply means simple. In other words, a translation of a complex language into something that would, for you and me, be simple. An English Bible is a simple translation because we can easily understand it. We also find in that particular period of time that there were other forms of writings that took the various parts of the New Testament and worked them together. Tatian developed, for example, something called a harmony of the Gospels, in which he took the various stories out of all four of the Gospels and put them together in one document, if you will, outlining the life of Christ in sort of chronological order. It was called the Desiderian, the Diatessairion is what it was called. I said that wrong. The Diatessairion. It remained, by the way, an important work in the Syriac churches all the way until the 7th century. It was rejected by the vast majority of people in favor of the actual Gospels. But it is one of those documents that shows us what was going on in the empire. Okay? We have a tendency to think of things being rather static from our perspective, right? You have a Greek New Testament, you've got a Hebrew Old Testament, ta-da! No, that's not how it works. People all over the place are looking for ways to understand what is written in their native tongue, and so learned men take these things and convert them into other languages. That is the way, by the way, in which the expansion of the gospel occurs. It is through the translations of the scriptures into other languages which allows them to go forward. In this case, to the east in Syriac, in the Syriac language. So let's talk about some of the places that it went then as we expand. If you look on your map, the first place that I have you show you is a place called Edessa. If you look just north of the big word Syria there, just straight north, you'll see Caesarea and Edessa. Edessa is situated then in the eastern regions of modern Turkey. It's above Syria and Iraq, below the Black Sea, as you can see. This area of the world is considered Upper Mesopotamia. In fact, this would be considered the northernmost point of the Fertile Crescent. You're familiar with the Fertile Crescent, that area of human civilization that stretches from the lower end of the Euphrates River there in the east, where it meets with the Tigris, the lower end of that yellow strip moving down to the right on your map. Okay, that's the lower end. If you simply follow that yellow curve up through Mesopotamia and then down through Syria, Damascus, and into Palestine, that's the Fertile Crescent. And that is exactly the route that Abraham himself took to get to Canaan. He lived at the lower end of the Euphrates River here, and he went north up into this area near Edessa. The city of Haran is located there. It's also, by the way, the name of his father, Haran. And you remember that when Abraham left home, it was his father, Haran, who actually took his family and moved to that area. And then his father died, making Abraham the patriarch of the family, who then moved himself and Lot into Canaan from that area. So he made that arc across. The city became Christian under a king of that place known as Abgarus IX, who reigned from about 179 to 216. Now put that into perspective. Where is 179 to 216? It's in the middle of the 2nd century, isn't it? It's long before Constantine is converted. Constantine was converted in roughly 311. And so you're looking at roughly 100 years even before the empire becomes Christian. Okay? In fact, Edessa becomes one of the earliest Christian states to ever exist in the world. Now, there's a legend that held that one of Abgarus's descendants, a man by the name of Abgarus V, who had lived during the days of Christ, or at about roughly the same time as Christ was in Palestine, that he wrote to Jesus a letter. He was a leper. He wrote to Jesus a letter in which he asked Jesus to come and to heal him. He had heard that Jesus could heal sick people and lepers. He had heard about this even from Edessa. So he sends a letter, and Jesus simply sends the apostle Thaddeus, one of his disciples, back to Abgarus V, who was healed. And this legend has grown up, of course, in this region as though that actually occurred. It's probably apocryphal. In fact, it's highly likely that it's apocryphal. But the letter, supposedly, copies of the letter, became talismans. You know what a talisman is, right? A talisman is an object that is used to to transmit some sort of blessing to you. A talisman is typically something that you touch to get healed. That's a talisman. So the letter itself, whatever it was, if it was even real, became a talisman amongst the people there. So it's much more likely, however, that the actual coming of Christianity to this area was missionaries that came to Edessa during Abgarus IX's reign, converting him and much of the city. So sometime during that 179 to 216 period, split the difference and say right about 200 AD, missionaries came to that particular place, preached the gospel, the king was converted, many in the city were converted, and it became one of the earliest Christian states in the world. Now you'll remember, this is during the persecuted church. Okay, it's not during the days of Constantine. That's still 100 years in the future. So this is during the days of the persecuted church. The church has already moved itself east into this place. And so we have a well-documented place where Christianity has already gone. A second place to the east is into Armenia. If you look up to the east of Edessa, you see the area known as Armenia. See it in big black letters there along the Caucasus Mountains, right? Situated northwest of Turkey. Now, Armenia had a unique role in the world at this time, during the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries. Armenia stood as a buffer between two empires. It stood between the Roman Empire to the west and the Persian Empire to the east. Now, you know that Iranians are of Persian descent. They're not of Arab descent, they're of Persian descent, because ancient Iran was actually the Persian Empire. Iraq is part of the Mesopotamian valley that you see here on your map. So if you continue further to the east to come to Iran, that's, by the way, the reason why Iraqis and Iranians despise each other, because they're not of the same ethnicity. They come out of a very different world. Armenia sits sort of between these two and acts sort of as a buffer between the Roman Empire to the west and the Persian Empire to the east. Now, the Armenians preferred, now, notice I'm saying Armenians, not Armenians, okay? Armenians are followers of Jacob Arminius from the 15th century. These are Armenians. They have an E instead of an I in their name, okay? That Armenia is still around, by the way, okay? So the Armenians preferred Roman rule because the Romans allowed them to remain as an independent area. They didn't really spend a lot of time sending their troops there. You'll notice how far away it is from Constantinople and even from Rome on this map. And so when you're that far to the east, the Romans are more likely to leave you alone. And so the Armenians found themselves preferring Roman rule. Modern Armenians insist that it was Bartholomew and Thaddeus, the same guy that went to Edessa, who brought Christianity to Armenia in about 50 AD, just shortly after Christ was raised and ascended, about the time that Paul was beginning his missionary journeys. However, historians point to someone else. It was a man by the name of Gregory Lusavorik, otherwise known as the Illuminator. That makes sense, right? Who brought Christianity there. He had a relative by the name of King Trad III who was in exile in Rome and was returned to the throne by Rome at some point during his reign. Lusavorik returned with him, and many were converted in Armenia to faith in Christ. In other words, they had gone back into Rome, and this is during the days when Rome now was a Christian empire. They were in the Roman territories, were converted to faith while there, and went back to Armenia with that faith. The king went back to his throne with that faith, and Lusavorik went back with that faith and converted many. In fact, it was Lusavorik converted the king, King Trat, baptized him on Epiphany. Celebration of the Epiphany on the liturgical calendar occurs on January 6th, or somewhere near there. Remember, the Epiphany is the celebration of the appearance of the Christ in the temple for his circumcision. That's the Epiphany. The word Epiphany means appearance. So he appears there. So the church calendar has had a celebration of Epiphany in that rough period of time. Apparently this occurred in 303. So just before the empire becomes Christian, but there's still a lot of Christians in Rome at this time. It's not officially there yet. Constantine's not been converted. But this man, Lucivoric, is able to convert him and baptize him. The scriptures are translated close to this time into Armenian, again, to the common language of the people there, so that they could read them. And the Christianity eventually moved from there north into the state of Georgia, not the United States of Georgia, the Georgian state that arrived just to the north, again, across the Caucasus. You think about the areas, the Caucasus Mountains, there's a number of former Russian, what do they call it, territories, or not territories, they're called, there's a name for them. Anyways, that Georgia was one of them, along with to the north. Today, 97% of Armenians are part of the Armenian Apostolic Church. So there is still a strong Christian presence in Armenia even today. But it is not a reformed version of Christianity. It followed a similar path that Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy did, closer to Orthodoxy on the eastern side, where it sort of stuck itself into the theological realities of the early centuries of the church, and then began to drift away slowly from some of the more key doctrines of the faith, like justification by faith alone. Orthodoxy doesn't embrace justification by faith alone any more than Roman Catholicism does, but that's just simply because of a drift over now 2,000, nearly 1,700 years of time, right? It's a very ritualistic, very conservative politically, and it's a Neo-Chalcedonian tradition. Now, what I mean by that is this, and I'm going to give you just a brief introduction to something, because this is what we're going to talk about in the next age of the church. There was another council called in Chalcedon in 451. This particular council was to determine the nature of Jesus, okay? What Nicene and Constantinople decided was the nature of the Godhead. All right? How do the Father and the Son and the Spirit relate to one another in terms of nature and person? But now the conversation will move into the nature of the person of Jesus himself. Who is Jesus? Is he fully divine? Is he fully human? What's the divine nature in him? What's the human nature in him? How do those two natures coexist? Etc. Chalcedon in 451 was the premier council to deal with that issue. We're going to talk about Chalcedon again in the future here. But because this particular church denied the Chalcedonian view of Jesus, they now embrace, and still do even to this day, embrace a monophysite view of Jesus. A monophysite view is that they believe that Jesus does have two natures, but those two natures melded together to become a single nature in him. They became one nature, monophysite, meaning of one substance. So they look to Jesus as being divine and human together, but those have been permanently intertwined together into a single nature. In other words, they attempt to understand this paradox of a man having two natures by simply collapsing the two natures into one. That's monophysitism. And we'll deal with that as we go into Chalcedon later. That will become, by the way, the new discussion of theology, Christology, as we move into the Middle Ages. Okay? So we see it move to Edessa. We see it move continuing east to Armenia. It also moves into Persia. The gospel does make its way into the Persian Empire. Again, the area of modern Iran, east of Mesopotamia. It is likely that Christianity wound up in Persia sometime in the 2nd century by Syriac-speaking Christians. So you're looking at the middle part of the 100s AD. So you're not talking long after the close of the canon of Scripture that somebody is bringing Christianity into Iran. The Parthian dynasty, which existed in Persia up until about 224, was tolerant of Christianity. accepted it as a part of society, and because of that it spread. Now you will notice, this is before Constantine, which means that what you have is you have in the Roman Empire, you have a persecuted church, but in Persia you actually have an accepted form of religion, even before it becomes that way in the Roman Empire. Unfortunately, of course, the Sassanid dynasty came to power after 224, and that particular dynasty considered Christianity to be a foreign religion. The paganisms of the Persian gods were being supplanted by Christianity, and so this particular dynasty began to persecute Christianity. So you have exactly the reverse taking place in Persia that you have in Rome. In the Roman Empire, you have a persecuted church rising to become the de facto church, the de facto religion in the empire. In the Persian Empire, it starts off being well embraced and accepted, and then it becomes persecuted after that. The embrace by Rome of Christianity heightened this persecution. Remember, the Persian Empire, Roman Empire, at odds with each other. If the guys in Rome become Christians, guess how the people in Persia are going to view the Christianity? They're going to see it as an enemy force because it's being embraced by their enemies. And so that's part of the reason why the Sassanid dynasty began to persecute Christians. Again, like those in Armenia, the Persians rejected the councils of Ephesus and Chalcedon, which dealt with the issues of Christ, and the Persian churches became monophysite. In the process of becoming monophysite, they broke from their relationship to Rome. Their connection to Rome as sort of the place where Christianity began for them is broken, and then, ironically, because the church embraced the monophysite view of Jesus, and because it broke away from Rome, the Persians said, okay, we won't persecute you anymore. Now, I guess I can understand that in this sense. If you are a Christian going around saying that Jesus is just a man, the Persians are not going to think of you as a threat. It's when you start claiming that he's God that it becomes another story. So monophysitism has a tendency, unfortunately, to weigh heavily on the human side of Jesus, as we'll see as we talk more about that in the future. One more area to the east, and that's to Arabia. So if you go south of Armenia down into the Arabian Peninsula, today that we would call that Saudi Arabia, on that peninsula, right? The vast majority of that peninsula now being controlled by Saudi Arabia. The spread of Christianity occurred there probably by the 2nd century. We note that by contacts from Alexandria who make mention of that particular area. The various forms of Christianity present around Arabia, from Rome and Persia and Ethiopia, produced a mixed form of Christianity, including a group called the Gnostic Alcacetes. I won't get into who they were. But there was a mixture of understanding of Christianity in this area. And I point that out for this reason. This was a very confused understanding of Christianity in terms of who Jesus was. And it was that form of Christianity that Muhammad knew and rejected. Okay? So modern apologists, Christian apologists like James White, who deal with Muslims, are constantly having to point out to Muslims that the Christianity that Muhammad railed against in the Quran is not biblical Christianity. It isn't the picture of what true Christianity is. So the Quran presents a straw man view of Christianity because the Quran, for example, suggests that Christians worship 3 different gods. Now, of course, as Christians and our Constantinople view of the Trinity, we would deny that. No, we do not. We worship a single God with one single nature in multiple persons who then appear in different places at different times, including the Son. So Muhammad's view is based on the fact that Christianity went to Arabia, got mixed with other forms of religion, a syncretism, if you will, and morphed into something that Muhammad himself rejected. And I would argue rightly so, because it wasn't genuine Christianity. Okay? Now that'll come more important when we talk about the rise of Islam when we get into the 8th century in the Middle Ages. Okay? So you can see Christianity finds its way to the east, into Armenia, into Edessa, into Arabia, even as far as to Persia. It is also true that we know that Christianity went all the way to India. In fact, some of the writers from Alexandria, I mentioned a moment ago, actually refer to Arabia, and what they mean is India, on the other side of the Indus River from Arabia. And so Christianity moved way east, much further east than we really think. So the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries explorers who went to India, or missionaries that went to India with the gospel, were not the first ones there. They were 1,800 years late. Okay. Christianity also expanded to the south. It expanded south from Egypt, as you can see down at the bottom of your map, extends south to Ethiopia. If you go to south there, you come down to Ethiopia. It is possible that the Ethiopian eunuch that we know of in the book of Acts, that Philip converted, you remember, may have in fact brought Christianity back there in the 1st century, but it is much more likely that Christianity originated there from Egypt to its north. Make much more sense that it would have come down after the writings of the apostles down into Ethiopia at that time. In fact, we know of 2 men by the name of Frumentius and Odysseus who were captured there. They were released. They were from Egypt. They were released from their capture there. They went back to Alexandria, returned there. Frumentius, after having been released from Ethiopia, comes back to Egypt. He is made a bishop under a guy by the name of Athanasius. Remember him? Okay, so he becomes a bishop, and he goes back to, went back to Axum, the center of Ethiopia. What we know is that about a century of missionary work it took for the king of Ethiopia to be converted and for much of the nation to come to Christianity. But it did spread there. However, like the Armenians, the Ethiopian church rejected the Council of Chalcedon, and some of the largest monophysite churches in the world are still in Ethiopia. There's still a strong sense of monophysite Christianity in the Ethiopian churches on the African continent. So it's gone to the east, it's gone to the south, but we also see it go to the west. Now, much of the movement of Christianity to the west, of course, occurs within the confines of the Roman Empire itself. If you will notice that most of the yellow that you see on your map encompasses the Roman Empire. Most of it. So the vast majority of the Christianity that would have spread through 300 at least and through 600 possibly is due to the fact that the Roman Empire occupied all of this particular space. But nonetheless, there were some places far to the west where Christianity spread. And one of them in particular that most historians point to is to Ireland. If you look way up in the upper left corner of your map, you see the island of Ireland. Typically, Christianity is attributed to St. Patrick coming to Ireland with it. In roughly 387, he lived from about 387 until 493. He was not Irish, however. He was Welsh. He came from Wales. He was captured in Wales at 16, and he became a slave in Ireland. He escaped. He returned to Wales, was converted, became a bishop in that place, in Wales, and had a vision to return to Ireland as a missionary. And he did. His early work there in Ireland was unimpressive. But as he stayed with it, he had much success later. As you know, even today, Ireland is a strongly Christian nation. Now, I understand it's 1,500 years removed from this time, so there is a strong Catholic and Protestant presence in Ireland, and we all know the political realities of that conflict's been going on for quite some time. But nonetheless, you will notice that on your map, there is a number of monasteries on the island, because there was a strong monastic movement that occurred in that particular period of time. In fact, many monasteries were formed, and the study of antiquity was all the rage. They did in those places is they studied the ancient writings. And so they began to collect antiquities, writings, objects of veneration, all sorts of things were brought up to Ireland by them. Now this happens to work out well for the church because Ireland was bypassed by the waves of the barbarians coming down from the Germanic peoples into Rome. Ireland being an island by itself, along with its sister Britain, of course, largely escaped the barbarian hordes, and this was a good thing because its monasteries became the main sources from which the Church of Rome regained much of the classical knowledge and literature that were lost during the period when the Vandals came to Rome. Because, you know, the Vandals didn't care what they destroyed. Didn't matter to them. Much was lost. But because the Irish had spent all of this time and energy collecting works of antiquity, the Roman Church later, as it began to become once again a stable entity, found its way to Ireland looking for much of this classic work. And so the Irish have been, strangely enough, a people where much of that was protected and saved. I think that was the providence of God, don't you think? So we see it moving way to the west. Much of the movement to the west, of course, is within the Roman Empire itself. But it also does move north into Europe. Now, you will notice that on this, the Rhine River pretty much divides the Roman Empire from Europe, the main, okay? Because all of Spain and Gaul and Illyria are part of actual continental Europe. But the center of Europe, to the east of the Rhine River, is occupied by non-Roman Empire folk, citizens, called the Germanic peoples. All right? And they're in that particular place. And when they come to the empire, when they come to Rome, when they come into the Roman territories, invading, ironically what happens is as they come and they're converted. Many of them are converted to Christianity. Now, that's not surprising. Again, if we're talking late into the Imperial Church here, right? Because we're talking well into the 5th century when Rome eventually falls. And so in the early part of the 5th century is when the Germanic peoples are pouring over the borders into the Roman Empire and sacking villages and setting up their own places and taking farmland. They're interacting with the neighbors. And guess what happens? They've come into Christian territory. And many of them are converted. And so they wind up taking much of their Christianity back. Now, a lot of this occurred during the time of Constantius. You remember this third son of Constantine. And it is during this particular time, even when Constantius wants to get help from the Germanic peoples for his wars against his brothers, okay? And so he's importing some. Remember we talked about this briefly when we were talking about the three sons. He was, you remember, an Arian, right? Much of the gospel at this point, the view of the Trinity was Arian. So we're going back prior to Athanasius now, and prior back to Nicene and Constantinople. So a man by the name of Ulfila helped bring the faith to Germanic tribes to the north of Constantinople. All right, so if you go north of the Danube along the Black Sea there into the Germanic territories just north there's a man by the name of Ulfila who helped bring the faith there. He actually developed an alphabet for the language of the Goths. They didn't have one. They had a language, but they didn't write it down. They spoke it. They passed it on from generation to generation verbally. So he developed an alphabet which allowed him then to translate the Bible into the language of the Goths. And so Christianity finds its way in as the scriptures are being converted. And there were also many Goths in the Imperial Guard in Constantinople. As I said, many had come down, even been sought out by Constantius to be involved in various aspects of life, to help him in his work. So there were many Goths in the Imperial Guard in Constantinople, near the middle part of the Imperial Church. And many, of course, were converted to Christianity just by being connected to others in that place. And they brought it back to the north. Thus, the irony is that many of those who were invading from the north, coming into Rome, were actually Arian Christians coming into Rome, because they had been converted by those who were part of Rome prior to the invasions, had brought the Christianity back to them, they had believed, and then they had become the invaders, bringing their faith back with them. Eventually, as it turns out, the Arian controversy would continue amongst the Germanic peoples to the north for a while longer than it did in the Roman Empire. Remember, we dealt with it in Nicaea and Constantinople. And it would stay up in the Germanic peoples for a while, but eventually Nicene Orthodoxy would overtake the Arian controversy even there. And so the Arian controversy eventually was stamped out worldwide, not just in the Roman Empire. Now, I bring all that to you for a reason, okay? Why this discussion? All right, let's think about some of the things about this expansion of Christianity. You and I, as Americans living in the 21st century, have an extraordinarily myopic view of the church, okay? Because the church we know is the church we know, which is just this little part. We have very little real view of the massive nature of the movement of Christianity throughout the world over the last 2,000 years. I suspect that most of you in this room were probably not even aware that there was a movement of the church outside of the boundaries of the Roman Empire into Persia and Armenia and Ireland and so forth. Even though when I bring it up, you go, well, that makes sense, right? Because we don't stop and really think about it. Our view of the Imperial Church, the age we've been talking about, is to leave the church entirely within the bounds of Rome. But it's not. It's expanding beyond the borders of Rome. And our Westerners' view is wrong. It is also wrong for us to assume that Christianity is an invention of the West. It is not. Christianity is not an invention of the West. In fact, the one who we worship as Lord was not a Caucasian European, contrary to the pictures of him that you may be seeing hanging in some people's rooms, right? He is not. He is a Middle Easterner. He would have had a Jewish ethnicity with a Jewish look to him. He would have been dark-skinned. He would have been very different looking than what we expect, and we might find ourselves being surprised when we actually see him in his glorified state as to what he actually looks like, because all of us as Westerners have this Caucasian view of Jesus, which is utterly wrong. But we also have this view of the church as though it has started in the West and then expanded out to the world from the West. No. It started off from the Middle East, it moved east, it moved west into Europe later, and it will only become really central to the West when the Roman Empire falls, and then over several hundred years as Europe begins to rise in terms of its strength, being generated literally by the church herself, moving from Rome into Europe. And then, of course, it will cross the Atlantic to us when we get into the 17th and 18th centuries, a long time later. Okay, so we need to keep that in mind. So we need to remember the words of Jesus himself in Acts chapter 1. You will be my disciples, and you will bring the gospel to Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria, and even to the uttermost parts of the earth. And I think that any valid historian of the modern era has to admit that during the early centuries of the church, during the persecuted church and the imperial church, the words of Jesus were taken quite literally and seriously, and the gospel went outside of Rome even, to the far corners of the earth. There's even some belief that it may even have gone as far as China in the first few centuries of the church. Now, many things change over time, of course, but nonetheless, we have a tendency to think of Christianity as fundamental to Western civilization, which it is, as though then it must be the product of Western civilization. No, quite the opposite. Western civilization is the result of Christianity spreading from the Middle East and the Roman Empire into Europe and then ultimately into the Americas. Christianity, we could say, the kingdom of God, advanced throughout the world as the Spirit moved men to copy the Scriptures into new languages and tongues and bring that faith with them where they went. It went south into Ethiopia, it went east into Persia, it went north into Armenia and into the Germanic peoples, it went west to all the way to Ireland in these days. So the Spirit of God is moving. Now, again, let me remind you of something I've said before and I want to repeat it. There's two layers of church history. The one layer is the layer that we're talking about here, which is the umbrella layer over the top, in which we sort of look down from 35,000 feet at all the things that are happening, right? Christianity moves here and there and here and there, and the Bible's translated different things, goes different places. That's one layer that is important, and that's fundamentally what we're talking about, the reason for this class. But there's a layer below that, a layer at the ground level, which is that even though we may look at the Armenian church and say, well, it's monophysite and it's no longer Orthodox Christianity anymore, having rejected the great councils of the faith, the reality is that there are still a remnant of faithful followers of Christ out there. They don't look like us, and they might not even believe exactly what we do, but they're trusting in Christ for their salvation, and they are being saved, and they are coming before the throne of God, the throne of Christ, and He is saying, well done, good and faithful servant. It's important for us to keep that in mind, okay? We have a tendency, I think, at times to sort of assume, look, if it ain't a Reformed Baptist church full of white folk, it ain't the real church, and that is a wrong view of church history, okay? All right? Now, that will get me kicked off of Twitter right there, okay? All right, so what we need to do then is we need to close the Imperial Church, and to do that, we're going to connect the close of the Imperial Church to the fall of Rome. Because most would say that really the Imperial Church must end, obviously, when the last emperor is no more. And we're talking, of course, about the emperor of the Roman Empire. So we can't call it an Imperial Church if there's no imperium underneath it anymore. All right, so let's talk about the fall of Rome. Now, I'm not going to bring to you a world history version of the fall of Rome here, okay? That's for someone else to do. I'm going to bring you a view of the fall of Rome that's going to sort of deal specifically with the issue of the church. So I'm going to give you just a few facts about the fall of Rome. We know, of course, that the fall of Rome occurs as the Germanic Vandals from the north invade. The Goths reached Constantinople by 378. Okay, so go straight south from that Germanic area, that big white area north of the Danube, come south into Constantinople. That's where the Goths come first. And they come to Constantinople, but they turn to the west because they go into more pliable areas of the empire. Around Constantinople, there is still great power in the emperor. Remember, Constantine moved his throne to Constantinople, right? And his sons ruled from Constantinople. And that's where the garrisons were of the Roman legions. And so guess where the Goths are less likely to find resistance? To the west. And so they turn from Constantinople and go to the more pliable areas of the Western Empire. Now, we're not talking about one single invasion here. We're talking about multiple invasions over periods of time. We're talking about hordes of Vandals falling over the boundaries into Rome and bringing with them their desire to take the lands and the places and the resources that are available in those places. And so they're coming for those things. The city of Rome itself fell to Alaric and his Goths in 410. So this would be, in 410, the unofficial fall of the Roman Empire. Okay? It's at this particular point when Rome is sacked. Now, the Roman Empire itself is not done because, in a way, you still have the emperor sitting in Constantinople. right? He's still over there in his place. But the main city of Rome becomes sort of a symbolic fall of the empire when the city by which it's named falls, okay? Now, we could make a lot of arguments as to why it fell, of course. Its decadence was at its peak at this point, and there's much to be said about why the people were simply not ready or prepared for the invasion forces coming in because they were so busy gazing at the navel and the lint in their navels that they weren't really interested in defending a people, which, by the way, we ought to be aware of. We're so navel-gazing as a people, we're not going to be prepared for what's coming. So when the city of Rome falls in 410, it will take another 66 years for the western half of the empire to fall. In fact, it will officially fall in 476 when the last emperor is deposed from his Roman throne. When the last western emperor is deposed in 476. Now, on your map, if you take Constantinople, if you draw a line, if you take basically everything west of Constantinople, okay, that is all the western side of the empire that falls. Everything from Constantinople through Asia Minor, towards Mesopotamia, south through Syria and Palestine, around to Egypt, and all the way over to North Africa, where Hippo sits over here, this becomes the Eastern Empire. The Western Empire, which included all of the Grecian peninsula, the Italian peninsula, southern Europe, the territories of France, Gaul, Spain, all that territory over there, it becomes at this point nothing more than a loose confederation of individual power brokers, is what it becomes. So after Rome officially falls, and there's no longer any control by Rome, all of that territory just sort of becomes independent. And individuals rise up in different places to take control over territories and so forth. And this will continue and forms the basis for how the church herself will grow up in this period of time and become what today we call the Roman Catholic Church, which was at that time the Western Church. Okay, so when the empire falls in 476, there is no Roman church in the official sense of what we know today. Okay? The Roman Catholic Church does not exist going all the way back to the popes. That is a lie that has been spun by the Catholic Church for a very long time. There is no unbroken succession of popes going all the way back to Peter. Because there's a whole chunk of time in here when there is no pope. In fact, the first pope hasn't even been declared yet at this point. Okay? So this becomes sort of a loose confederation of individual little power brokers, individual little states, which then eventually becomes and morphs into the Holy Roman Empire. Okay? And we'll talk about the Holy Roman Empire as we get into the Middle Ages, because that'll be one of the key elements of the West in that direction. The church would then continue for the next 1,000 years in the East under the Byzantine Empire. We call it now the Byzantine Empire. Once the two empires are split apart by virtue of the Vandals coming in, the West falls, the eastern side now loses that Roman name and becomes the Byzantine Empire, which will continue for another 1,000 years until the Muslims overthrow it. Okay? So it's going to continue for quite some time. The church in the West, as I said, would remain largely independent and scattered until the rise of the West, the European continent states and the Holy Roman Empire. The invaders from the north were, as I pointed out before, pagans that were converted over time into Christians, and they went about going back to their places in Europe, north, creating new churches, establishing new leadership. And as I said, the invasion resurrected the issue of Arianism again, but it would be subsumed eventually to Nicene Christology by those who had been overtaken. So the invasion of the Goths from the north begins the period known as the Middle Ages. We call them the Middle Ages is because it's the period between the classical Roman era, which ended in the mid-400s, to the modern era, which will begin in the 15th century. So from the 5th century to the 15th century is a 1,000-year period which we call the Middle Ages, the middle of the church age. And as you can see, it is the single largest period of church history, lasting 1,000 years. And we'll talk about why when we come back together. Now, I want to close with some thoughts about the Imperial Church itself. This short period of church history, encompassing only about 100 years of time. But you will notice how much went on in that period of time. This is that very short window of time. After the church steps out from under that heavy persecution and becomes the de facto religion of the state, it endures a period of 100 years, even longer, I suppose, if you want to go 150 years out to the end of the Roman Empire. You're looking at a period of intense Christian activity. There's a lot crammed into this period of time. What you're going to discover is that when we get into the Middle Ages, we're going to be able to talk about blocks of time, centuries in length, where there's virtually nothing to talk about in that period of time. In fact, sometimes the Middle Ages are also known as the Dark Ages for that reason. So in this particular period of time, there's a number of things I would draw to your attention. First, the theological struggles, okay? Probably the most significant thing that happened during this little 100 to 150 year period of time was the great theological struggles. The greatest, of course, being the struggle over the very nature of God himself and how Christians understand God. Now, we'll come to another theological struggle which will be just as significant, if not even more significant, when we get into the early Middle Ages, just before the fall of the empire and rolling over into the after the fall of the empire, the Western Empire, in which we'll deal with the Christological problem, as I mentioned before, the very nature of Jesus himself. But the theological struggles during this period point to a truth that mustn't be forgotten, and that is, there will be theological struggles in the church in every age. There will be theological struggles in every age. In the Imperial Church, the issue was the nature of God. Later, in that same period, and moving into the Middle Ages, you had the whole Christological issue of Jesus. As you move later into the Middle Ages, we're going to see theological problems come up with the relationship of the church and the state, leadership issues, and the nature of the gospel itself. And then we move into the Reformation, of course. We have massive theological struggles that are going to take place. And then pouring even into the modern church, we've seen theological struggles of the relationship between liberalism and fundamentalism. And now as we move into a new age of the church, I think, which I'll call the post-Christian church, we move into the issues of wokeism and critical race theory and all kinds of new theological struggles that are starting up again, because there will always be struggle in the church as long as the church is made up of sinful men. And as long as the church also has within it tares amongst the wheat. There will always be that. Jesus himself said that to his disciples. There will always be tares amongst the wheat. And then he went so far as to say, but I'll straighten it out on the judgment day. Don't go out and try to pull up the weeds now. You just pull up the good stuff with it. Okay, that's number one. Second, the issue of the connection of the church to the state. Okay, when you have a church that is indebted to the state because the state makes it a de facto religion, that produces issues and problems. That will continue in every generation, in every age of the church. It's going to be a particularly big one when we start talking about the Holy Roman Empire, because you're going to find the church and the state becoming one, with the church being the primary leader of society, not the empire. All right, that's going to be a whole nother issue. In other words, we're going to flip it on its head, where the church, the bishops then become the de facto leaders of society rather than an empire. Thirdly, hopefully you have noticed, as we've talked about the Imperial Church, that the church does not look as all one size and shape throughout history. As I said a minute ago, it doesn't look like us in order to be the true church. God has his remnant all over the place. And so you might have had generations of Arian Christians in the Imperial Church, who, as I said, on this lower level of church history, were faithful followers of Christ. They understood only what they could know in their day, because that's all that they had. All the light that they had was, well, God is one. That's all they knew. So we must be careful that we don't attempt to impose 21st century ideas of salvation upon God in terms of how he deals with his people in ages past. We would never expect that from people who live 1,000 years from now, right, upon ourselves. We mustn't do it to people who lived 2,000 years ago. We need to be careful that we understand that there are certain theological realities that are undoubtedly true and cannot be lost. But there's a whole lot of secondary and tertiary things about belief that are not required to be saved. You don't have to be a Reformed Christian to be saved. Many of us were saved in an Arminian environment. And we know that we were believers for a long time until we came to understand things in a better way. Imagine that you lived 1,500 years ago with the light that would be available in that time frame. Okay, so we need to be careful with that. That's one of the reasons why I think a church history class is important, because it helps us to kind of step out of our own little comfort zone and go back and think, what did these people know and what did they have? And then finally, I think probably the most important fact, God is at work in every generation. The Spirit of the living God was sent by Christ to lead people from every tribe and every tongue and every nation to faith in Christ. And even the short little history lesson that we did tonight across this map demonstrates that that Spirit is at work in the world. And here's the thing. None of us have any idea what he's doing out there in the world. We have no clue who the gospel is going to, even at this moment, somewhere on this planet, where someone is hearing the gospel and repenting of their sin and trusting in Christ. They have this much knowledge of who Christ is, because the first time they've even heard the name Jesus, potentially, but they're believing this message. The Spirit of God is at work doing what he's doing. We have the luxury of having access to massive amounts of information and familiarity with Christianity. That there are many, 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 many people, the vast majority of humans on this planet, that never had or never will have. But God has his remnant. God knows who his elect are, and he is sending his army of faithful proclaimers of the gospel out into the world. And sometimes those people don't even go out with the true gospel, but they preach a message that somehow produces faith in the lives of people all over the planet. And so we need to, one of the things we can learn by talking about these various ages of the history of the church is to recognize that God doesn't work according to the nice little clean 21st century Western American view of things. He's not interested in the scientific method to accomplish his ways in the world. He is working in ways beyond our imaginations. And so the Imperial Church is an excellent example of that. We might look back at those and go, man, those are some stupid people. And how could they not have understood these things? And how could they fall into this trap or that trap and do this and say that and write this and write that? Because God works in mysterious ways. We don't know how he's working in the world, but he will usher in the kingdom of Christ. And age after age after age, he is moving in the world. I'll close on this. I heard the other day someone say, based on the whole discussion of church history and the fact that there's been 2,000 years of it now that we have endured as a church, is it possible that we are still living in the early church? Is it possible that there is still another 6,000 years or 5,000 years of church history yet to go before all of the elect from every tribe, tongue, and nation have been called by God into the world? Yeah, I know the dispensationalists want you to believe that the rapture is tomorrow, but what if we're living in the early church still? And we are struggling with some of those most profound things that need to be dealt with before the gospel finally permeates all of this world and converts all nations into the kingdom of God. What if we're just living in the very earliest part of that? Some of us are like, that's depressing. But at the same time, you've only got 70 on this earth anyways, and God can carry on with you not here, but you will come back with him into what he completes in the end. So I mean, it's kind of like, it would be nice if it was over tomorrow, but there's no promise of that. 20 centuries of church history should have taught us that. There is no promise. I wonder how many of all those people living in the Imperial Church were expecting Christ to return in their lifetime. All right, so that concludes our analysis of the Imperial Church.